Cyberpunk 2077 has had years of hype, and almost nothing in the game lives up to it. Neither does the game offer anything new than other games before it, and many video game journalism articles fail to separate that expectation and hype from the reality of Cyberpunk 2077 as it stands now. This is not our final review of the game, just my thoughts so far, but don't you worry, Ray and my final thoughts are coming soon. Don't forget to hit that bell icon for notifications when that drops. So first off, if you enjoy the crafting mechanics in Cyberpunk, you may want to stop, or risk losing your save file. A new bug has been reported by Keith Mitchell of Tom's Hardware, and he writes, Cyberpunk 2077 PC bug causes corruption in game saves, reports. Just when it seems like the PC may be the least headache-inducing version of the game, CDPR found a new way to muck that up. And their response? A whole lot of not much, as the Tom's Hardware article states, quote, when presented with the issue, CD Projekt Red acknowledged on the official CD Projekt forums that it is aware of the issue despite not making an official announcement. The developer informed those affected that there isn't currently a fix. In other words, once your save game is corrupted, there's nothing you can do about it short of reloading a backup of the save. On GOG, a distribution software competitive with Steam and owned by CDPR, they confirm the issue but only state that the save file limit might be increased in one of the future patches, but the corrupted files will remain that way. This is an unconscionable error, and really just a big middle finger from CDPR and an acknowledgement that, yeah, we know the game is quite literally broken, maybe we'll fix it, maybe we won't. And just to be clear, this bug is mostly going to affect people who have a lot of time in the game, aka people who are actually playing the game and enjoying it enough to have a save file that large, myself included. Luckily for me, I haven't spent much time crafting other than to get experience for extra perk points, since I think the system is fairly shallow. But if I got that bug, I wouldn't see much point in continuing to play Cyberpunk 2077, and I definitely wouldn't see a point in picking it up if I haven't already played it. Apparently this isn't a new problem the company has faced either. The article goes on to explain, quote, the problem seems similar to past issues in The Witcher 2, where game saves would increase in size, causing longer loading times and eventually leading to corrupted game saves. The GOG response makes it sound like they could increase the size limit if they wanted, and for a bug that literally breaks saves, fixing it should be one of their first priorities. But the PC version already has better reviews, CDPR already has their money, and to get the bug, you have to clock in a playtime that would prohibit most refunds. In a Game Crate article by Angelo M. D'Argenio, titled Review, Cyberpunk 2077 is the most fun I'll ever have playing a total mess, is an example of the kind of article that has left me wondering how many journalists who have covered this game actually bothered to play it at all. As more information is being revealed about the lengths CD Projekt Red went to keep their console performance a secret, though no disclaimer indicating such was offered by any major video game journalism enterprise until the week after its release, the continued coverage of the fairly stable PC version of the game still leaves much to be desired, such as an accurate account of how far off Cyberpunk 2077 is compared to the marketing of the game right up until launch. The article starts out by saying, quote, it is genuinely one of the most ambitious projects I have experienced in modern gaming, and CD Projekt Red deserves to be praised for that. While nobody can dispute the game's graphical ambition on modern and often exclusionary hardware, very little of the game is actually ambitious in the sense that it brings fresh ideas or grand moment-to-moment experiences. As is common with Cyberpunk 2077 coverage, this is just a flat assertion with no justification. The visuals are gorgeous and the environment is impressive, but it strikes me as odd to call ambitious a game which really just took various aspects from other games but did them worse, which we'll get into specifics later. The first section of this article is, quote, the most open of open worlds, and goes on to say, quote, here the corps rule everything and the few lucky get rich enough to suckle at their teat. Meanwhile, the common folk scrape and scrounge, trying to get together enough eddies, that's future lingo for money, for a quick meal and rent. There are three key reasons why Cyberpunk 2077 falls short of an open world game like Grand Theft Auto. The first of which is the NPCs are horrible. Nothing that they or the main character V do actually indicates anything like what the article describes. The immersive environment and crowds was something that I had heard touted up until launch, but the NPCs are lifeless husks that, despite the article's assertion, do not scrape nor scrounge or seem to do much of anything but walk to and fro, sometimes reacting to V's actions by assuming a fetal position or running away. Unlike in games like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption, they don't have independent animations for just living life, talking in a group, hanging out on the stoops, actually enjoying a drink or a meal, no random occurrences or arrests in the process. They actually remind me a lot of the NPCs in Naughty Dog's classic hits Jak 2 and Jak 3 of the Jak and Daxter series. They may not have been the main draw or motivator, that being the missions and platforming gameplay, but they moved about from point A to point B, ducking if you fly a vehicle over them, and running away if assaulted. But that's about the extent of their behavior, and unfortunately the NPCs in Cyberpunk don't do much else. While good NPC AI isn't necessary to make a great game, Jak 2 and Jak 3 are still some of the best games I've played, it doesn't match up to what was promised or even what would be capable of a game in development since 2013. For comparison, Jak 2 came out in 2003 on the PS2. The Game Crate article continues, quote, "You do what you have to survive, maybe take some seedy jobs or run afoul of the law, or even sell your soul to the corpse for a chance to live the short high life." And herein lies the second reason Cyberpunk falls short of Rockstar's games. The cops aren't really cops, they're just artificial disincentives to break the law for a truly open experience. Now one might argue that that's literally the point of law enforcement, but the difference with Rockstar's police and CDPRs is that the Cyberpunk police are so technologically advanced they can spawn directly behind you after committing a crime. Break enough laws and they spawn with game-ending missile launchers. In GTA, the police will actually scour the area the crime was committed and you engage in a game of cat and mouse and go into hiding for a spell. Red Dead Redemption has a looser system, probably more analogous to what Cyberpunk's should be, with a witness system and bounties. In the early parts of the game, when V is driving with Jackie and they first revealed the NCPD, I was honestly terrified of having to break the law. I was already running mental gymnastics that I'd have to be careful, unseen, potentially worrying about a bounty on my head that was unavoidable in the sprawling metropolis I would inevitably have to venture through to progress. It was a prophetic moment for a lot of what I would come to experience playing Cyberpunk 2077. My own imagination setting expectations that in a post-Rockstar open-world game world should be standard wouldn't even come close to meeting. The police are a joke in the game. They are, on the one end, totally ineffectual and laughably easy to avoid, but poke the bear one too many times and they are a guaranteed flatline. Again, one of the most hyped things in some of the first moments of the game proved to be one of the most pathetically implemented. The last difference between Rockstar open-world games and Cyberpunk 2077 isn't necessarily a shortfall, but rather a stylistic difference that breaks the Grand Theft Auto projections this game wants to put out. There are no hospitals when you die. Instead, you are taken back to the last save rather than revived with a small hit to your wallet. For a game that is essentially a logical extreme of our current healthcare system, this omission seems like a huge wasted opportunity that is a little too comfortably Witcher-like for a game that is, as Angelo D'Argenio asserted, quote, genuinely one of the most ambitious projects I have experienced in modern gaming. Again, for context, Grand Theft Auto V came out in 2013, the year that development of Cyberpunk 2077 began. The article goes on to say, quote, "You play V, and that's all I can tell you about the main character because their backstory is yours to choose. At the very beginning, you decide whether you grew up on the street, grew up on the outskirts, or grew up with a silver spoon in your mouth. From there, you hit up the character creation and start the game, and paths diverge wildly." Comments like these are the main fuel for my suspicion that these journalists are not being as critical as they should be. To say their backstory is yours to choose is just not true. The entire game, we are playing a character that CDPR has already prescribed inasmuch as Geralt of Rivia. The only difference is rather than having a character creation like in Bethesda's Skyrim, the player gets to choose what V looks like. With someone like the Dragonborn in Skyrim or the Nerevarine from Morrowind, the character is a blank slate, an avatar that the player can project themselves into those worlds. They may be important to the overall lore and Tamriel history, but their personalities are silly putty to reflect whatever the player wants. This is not the case with V, even in the beginning scenarios, which really only represent a 30 to 60 minute mission before converging on the same story as the others, are all curated by CDPR for the purpose of a unique line every once in a while to fuel an artificial desire for replayability. The Dragonborn's origins, despite always starting the game awaking in imprisonment to be executed, are shrouded in mystery because much like in Cyberpunk, they really don't matter. The game plays the same regardless. It's very analogous to Fallout 4's main story and protagonist. In Fallout 4, the player is not creating the character of the sole survivor, but rather choosing what the prescribed character looks like. But at least in Fallout 4, the sole survivor's personality and responses weren't limited to blue gather information and gold progression. I can understand why game developers would prefer prescribed characters like V or the sole survivor, rather than truly open characters like the Dragonborn or even Mass Effect's Commander Shepard. Especially in the case of Mass Effect, having a prescribed character with specific dialogue options would cut down on the time and costs for voice acting. Especially when even the inclusion of voice acting in dialogue-driven games like Mass Effect or Fable, if you get far enough down the dialogue tree, eventually the result in most of the NPC's responses are exactly the same, sacrificing true consequences to make the development easier. I'm not even convinced that this is a bad thing, since with most of these playable characters, the game is ambiguous enough that my imagination can fill in the blanks. The problem with characters like the sole survivor, and especially with V, is that they are written so as to prohibit this. They each have their own goals wholly separate from mine. Maybe I don't care about the sole survivor's son, and maybe I want to play Cyberpunk having my psyche taken over by Johnny Silverhands. But the games prohibit them because in order to progress, I have to want to get the survivor's son back or prevent a Keanu Reeves takeover. In Cyberpunk 2077, I can be whoever I want to be, as long as it is within what CDPR have determined I'm allowed to be. The Game Crate article continues, quote, Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the most open of open world games yet. V's personality changes depending on your stats and the way you play. Pick a few dialogue choices and your jobs, connections, even main plot quests will change dramatically. No two players will experience the same game. Here I think the ambiguous language is deceiving. I'd have to play multiple rounds to be sure, but rather than V's personality literally changing depending on your stats, the game implements Fallout-style skill checks, which can give more options for V's responses. But again, this isn't anything new and has been a staple of RPG games since tabletops. Really, it seems like what the author means is that certain dialogue options open up depending on previous responses, but this inevitably means that certain options would therefore be prohibited. Very rarely are there truly multiple options that are separate from a yes or no or the blue-gold dichotomy. He continues, I played alongside a colleague and found that we didn't meet the same character or get the same options in major dialogue scenes. Only a few main story beats are consistent, and even then they change up a bit from playthrough to playthrough. There are no provided examples of what changes occur, and in my experience so far, the differences really surmount to whether there is a shootout or not, but many of the characters met or not met are dependent on whether or not certain side missions or gigs were discovered, not necessarily choices pertaining to the main story. But to say Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the most open of open world games yet is hilarious in a game that literally says, turn back, there is nothing for you here yet, when there is clearly something over there. Even if it was just an empty hill overlooking Night City, Death Stranding was full of empty hills and plains, but the point of an open world game is the ability to explore the open world. The article goes on to say, quote, there is a bit of smoke and mirrors making this all work. I was surprised that a fixer I did a lot of side jobs for suddenly became relevant in the main story. For a while, I was in awe at how the devs could have allowed for so many different possibilities with so many different NPCs to somehow have a noticeable effect on the main plot. It is true that the interconnectivity of the characters in the missions is impressive, one of CDPR's strengths. However, the implication is that the fixer became relevant because of doing their side jobs, not that the fixer was already going to be important and they just happened to do their side jobs first. The author claims, quote, "Then I realized that the game probably just keeps track of which side quests you've done and slots in one of the NPCs you've been working with whenever you need someone to forward the narrative. This to me surmounts to a pat on the back for answering a question without knowing if the answer is correct or not. Then I realized that the game probably just keeps track really just to me sounds like, I think this would be cool if it were true, so I'm going to assume it is. And giving CDPR credit which they may not deserve. Again, I'll have to do more playthroughs to confirm if this is the case or not, but this proclamation seems very premature, especially given the incredibly tragic history Cyberpunk 2077 is already suffering from." The article continues, "Cyberpunk wants you to make the decision of who to talk to and how to solve problems. It's not going to ferry you from point A to point B until the end credits roll. You have to work your connections, trust your judgment, and rely on your skills in order to craft a story all your own." Again, this isn't the player's story, it is from beginning to end a curated experience from CDPR. All stories in games are to a certain extent manufactured, but in Cyberpunk it isn't about who you choose to talk to, it's when you choose to talk to them. Inevitably, all of the branches of the main story will come together for an almost identical climax with a few different endings. You'll have the 3 main story quest lines which you can do in any order, but you have to do them. In Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, for example, there is a main quest line, but you can ignore it instead to gain favor with guilds or the main houses, only to find that in the main story you would have had to do that anyway. You can even ignore the main quest for a rich experience exploring Daedric ruins or trekking to Solstheim. While technically you can ignore the main quest in Cyberpunk 2077, there is an artificial pressure to progress the main quest for V's health. And much like ignoring the missions in Grand Theft Auto, you can have a fun time in the sandbox, but the more you ignore it, the more you realize how little there is to do. Cyberpunk 2077 falls between these two extremes. While there is a lot of content to do besides the main story, absent these missions, there isn't much meat on the immersion side of the game. It tries to be a Bethesda game in a Rockstar suit, but really it just turns into a bland version somewhere in between. Despite the game's shortcomings, the actual gameplay still shines. The stats and perks are fairly extensive and trigger my dopamine reward brain center constantly. The feel of the gunplay is some of the best I've experienced, right up there with Fallout 4, and the smart and tech weapons are extremely fun. The stealth is pretty good, and coupled with some of the quick hacks like knocking out an enemy's vision or jamming their weapons, I felt like I was playing some of the best moments of Dishonored. The leveling up mechanic is not entirely well explained, but has a nice level of complexity, although to get full use out of it, my min-maxer brain is forced to use weapons I wouldn't otherwise want to. Luckily, these mechanics are some of the most apparent, and so it's much more difficult for reviewers to imagine their own fancy as to how they work or claim to have options they in fact do not. On its own, I still think Cyberpunk 2077 is a fun game, but against the backdrop of what was promised and the journalistic coverage of the game, it's a huge disappointment. The more I play Cyberpunk 2077, the sadder I become about what could have been. I'm sure developing the next big game is more difficult than just make it better, but there are almost countless examples of open-world games these days, and CDPR chose to ignore all of them, the most crucial of which is the ability to roleplay. The Game Rant article states, quote, "I built my character as a super intelligent hacking prodigy. I snuck around, infiltrated networks, took control of cameras, and used automated weapons and non-lethal takedowns. But then I did a job where an NPC that I took a liking to ended up dying. The game took away my gear and left me on the street with nothing but a knife. Now I could have continued to hack my way through the game, but my first few blade kills leveled up my bladed weapon skill, which made me want to use them more." Rather than being able to roleplay in a game with too many options, this author claims that CDPR deserves praise for forcing roleplay by taking away all other options. Now, I'm a huge fan of quests that see the protagonist in a fall from grace, where you are temporarily stripped of what you got to get you to that point. Unfortunately, CDPR gave us too much of the latter and not enough of the former. Too many options taken away rather than provided for us. And no matter what your opinion of Cyberpunk 2077 is, it's hard to see how doing so makes this game, quote, one of the most open of open world games yet. For context, the Game Crate article was written on the 14th, a few days after launch, and perhaps not enough time for the author to fully fledge out their assessment of the game. But a recent New York Times article titled, quote, Cyberpunk 2077 was supposed to be the biggest video game of the year. What happened? By Mike Isaac and Kellen Browning, provides a much more nuanced view and a dire picture for CDPR and AAA studios as a whole. They point out that, quote, in 2012 it was billed as a gripping, free-flowing saga that would immerse players in a lifelike sci-fi universe. But they go on to say that Cyberpunk's rollout is one of the most visible disasters in the history of video games, a high-profile flameout in the midst of the holiday shopping season by a studio widely considered an industry darling. It shows the pitfalls gaming studios can face when building so-called AAA games, titles backed by years of development and hundreds of millions of dollars. But it is also a tale that insiders said they saw coming for months based on CD Projekt Red's history of game development and warning signs that Cyberpunk 2077 might not live up to its sky-high expectations. As I said earlier, Cyberpunk 2077 tries to dip its hands in multiple honeypots but comes up short in almost every case. In a practice not new to CDPR talking about The Witcher, the New York Times article reports that employees said that often much of the game development took place in-house, bucking the common industry practice of contracting out such tasks to other more experienced studios. As a result, the developers created worse versions of features that had been perfected by other companies. And despite Witcher 3's Game of the Year status, in retrospect this was perhaps obvious back then. The combat felt like a worse version of Dark Souls, and was also a buggy mess before CDPR took the time to fix it. The article reports what seems to be the emerging narrative that the developers of the game are just as frustrated as the players, claiming, quote, inside CD Projekt Red it was a very different story. Developers were increasingly concerned with some of the grand promises being made by management on the promotional marketing tour. Far into the game's development, former employees said the hyper-customizable and endlessly explorable world being sold to players was nowhere close to manifesting. From my own experience, I was shocked at how actually limiting the character customization was. I had heard you could be anybody you want to be, but the reality is that for every new way you can customize V in Cyberpunk, there's an equal and opposite restriction. Sure, you can customize your cybernetics, piercings, tattoos, and so forth, but rather than choosing them individually, they all come as presets, many of which are forced to be symmetrical. Sure, you can customize your teeth, nails, among other things, but the options are so limited it's a wonder why CDPR even bothered. Every time I read an article describing the character customization as limitless with sliding scales, I actually get angry. Elder Scrolls Oblivion had sliding scales, and that character customization was horrible. Not that it matters much in Cyberpunk since there is no third person and you're only forced to look in a mirror a handful of times. The only benefit of the doubt I'd give CDPR is that I'd hope the character customization is more comprehensive for the multiplayer version, if that is even in development anymore, but that if they were going to cut anything for time's sake, then I'd rather it be customization. But what is unforgivable is the overt lies we were told about the character building from both CDPR, but also from game journalism. Journalists can, however, be forgiven for not reporting the problems with the console version, since according to the New York Times, typically game developers send early copies of new titles to reviewers with ample lead time, but CD Projekt Red kept Cyberpunk 2077 under wraps for as long as it could. The company only shared advanced copies of the PC version with gaming publications and news organizations, previewing the best possible version of Cyberpunk to reviewers who would post their ratings online just days before the game's release. For months, reviewers, including those at the New York Times, tried to obtain review copies for the new game consoles released by Sony and Microsoft this year. Stephanie Beyer, a spokeswoman for CD Projekt Red, said in a previous email correspondence that the company would hold off sending our console codes until close to launch, so that they could send them securely. That never happened. While journalists can't be blamed for not reporting information they don't have, they should have been much more transparent about the lack of access to console copies well before the launch date. To my knowledge, we're only discovering this was the case after the game has already been out, even though they apparently had been asking CDPR for console review copies for months. So where does that leave us with the game now? Not really in a great position. CDPR is now being compared to Bethesda's horrible launch of Fallout 76. Unlike Bethesda, who in addition to developing games like The Elder Scrolls and Fallout, are also publishers for huge series like Doom, Dishonored, and Wolfenstein, CDPR pretty much only has the Witcher series. Cyberpunk 2077 is their first new game. They reported recouping their development and marketing costs on pre-orders alone, but how many of those have been refunded, not to mention the lack of incoming revenue after it's being pulled from the PlayStation Store. According to New York Times, CD Projekt Red said Friday that it would refund disappointed players out of their own pocket if necessary. The company's stock has dropped 41% since early December. And to make matters worse, lawyers and investors in Warsaw are circling the situation, contemplating a class action lawsuit against the company for what one attorney described as potential criminal misrepresentation in order to receive financial benefits. All of that casts a pretty dire shadow over not just the future of Cyberpunk 2077, but CDPR as a whole. They also own the Steam competitive distribution platform GOG, which would be a huge loss for DRM-free PC gamers, but could tip the scale for either Steam or an ambitious Epic Games. Really, the question comes down to, can the Witcher money support CDPR through these troubling times? And the answer is, maybe. It's going to be a stressful 2021 for CDPR. If you made it this far, just wanted to say thanks. I'm Dylan, and if you found this video informative or useful, please give it a like. Leave us a comment with something you hope they'll fix in Cyberpunk, or if you think CD Projekt Red can recover or not. If you want to hear more game news and reviews in the future, ring that bell icon. There's always room on the couch, so don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button.